Okay. Let me just recap what I said. So hi everyone, welcome to the database lecture. I believe Armaan has already taken you through the Django and the Express tutorial, and these are very good frameworks for building a backend server. And so, what's the difference between a server and a database? A server is where you accept all the front-end requests from the browser. So for instance, if a user wants to log into Facebook, they will first send a login request to the server, and then the server will process all the data and then go into the user database to find the corresponding user entry and to and then see whether the user can be allowed to log in. So essentially, server is a place to handle all the requests, and database is a place for you to store all the data. So yeah, and if you look at our Notion database basic page, you will see that. So first of all, what's a database? It's a type of infrastructure to store large amount of data in computer science. A database is also all around us. For instance, if you share a photo on your Instagram, your photo and all the related text will be stored into a database. If you remove a friend on Snapchat, you are accessing this database and deleting an entry from the friends column in your specific user entry. So there are mainly two types of databases that we usually use throughout our industry practice. First is the SQL database, and the second is called the NoSQL database. And SQL database in particular is what you will be learning in school, aka CS 186. This is also a pretty fun course. I highly recommend to take it. SQL database is kind of like the traditional sense of a database, where it looks very much like a table. You can actually think of it as like just a super large table. And SQL is database table based, which means that it consists of rows and columns. And there are like several common SQL databases. For instance, MySQL, SQLite, Oracle Cloud Database. And today we are going to teach you about PostgreSql. Postgresql. So let me write it down. Cool. And this is how a SQL database will look like. Essentially, it just looks like a table, and then there are several columns. Columns are just like different fields that each entry can have. For instance, here I guess it's probably a people database, store all the relevant information for people. And then for the first row, it's Natalia, and they're from Iceland. Essentially, like each row represents one object, one entry stored in a database, and each column represents one specific field. So that's for the SQL database. And there's also NoSQL database. So why do we call it NoSQL database? It's essentially saying that any database that's not SQL database like will be called NoSQL database. So there are, as you can imagine, there are quite a lot of different types of NoSQL databases. In particular, there's one that's used very widely, which is called MongoDB. NoSQL database, and specifically MongoDB, uses a document-like way to store all our data. In our courses about backend, you probably learn about Json. What Json does is it's essentially a way to format all your data. So here in the picture down below, this is an example of like JSON data format. As you can see, it's in a nested curly bracket, and then it will be like name and value pair. And this is how a NoSQL database or like a MongoDB database will store the data as well. So for instance, a row in an entry in a SQL database will be like this, like Nat 6 New York. However, if it's a NoSQL database, it will be curly bracket name NAT, then age 6, and then country. New York's not a country. That's pretty weird. But for instance, country will be United States. So yeah, and this will be NoSQL databases, and we will teach MongoDB later in the course as well, together with Express. So yeah, and yeah, this is just a recap of what I just said. So in our lesson, we will be covering both like PostgreSQL and also MongoDB, so that you can have like a good idea both on the SQL database and also NoSQL database. So for SQL database, we choose to combine Django and PostgreSQL because these are pretty common, pretty popular choices. Also, Express and MongoDB is also a pretty popular choices. So yeah. Any questions so far? Let's see in the chat. My favorite country, New York. Yeah. That's the image from like Google. So yeah.
Wait, could you say again like why you combine the Express with the MongoDB? Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. So why do we combine Express with MongoDB? Because usually MongoDB use JSON-like format to store our data. When we are using JSON, it's very easy to like manipulate JSON with the help of JavaScript, and that's why we usually see people combine Express with MongoDB. However, you can also use Python. For instance, you can also use Django with MongoDB. It's also a very popular choices, and there are quite a lot of packages for you to use to, write JSON easily in Django. So yeah, this is just a more common choices, I would say.
So it's basically interchangeable, right? Or
yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. You can use Express with Postgres. You can use Django with MongoDB. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Okay, so now let's move on to some real world coding example. And today we will try our best to cover both part 1 and part 2 because they kind of like are together. However, there are like quite a lot of content to be covering. If we can't really finish it, that's okay. I can continue on Monday. So yeah, but we'll try. So now let's talk about PostgreSql. So PostgreSql, what's PostgreSql database? It's a SQL database. It's a very, very robust SQL database. It's compared to like, for instance, SQLite, it's very robust and there's a very good GUI interface to use, and it's widely used in industry as well. And that's why we decide to talk about PostgreSql instead of like SQLite. Also, if you're interested, we taught SQLite in our previous semester. So if you're interested in learning SQLite as well, feel free to look at our past lecture. And first of all, you need to install PostgreSql database. Sorry. I find the easiest way is to use this postgre.app. And if you install like PostgreSQL database by hand, there's quite a lot of difficult configuration you need to do. So using this link, this is the best way for you to download PostgreSQL database with a GUI interface. And after you download it, we can start create our first Postgres database. So how do we interact with Postgres? Very easy. After you download the Postgres app, you will have this elephant logo here. And then if it's like running, if you see like a tick here, that means it's running. And then you can type PSQL inside your terminal. And then this will prompt up a PostgreSQL console. And this console allows you to interact with the Postgresql database. And so, yeah. And now let's try to create our very first Django, very first Postgres database. So this is the command for creating a database inside like the console. Please remember to add the semicolon after each command, because this is how you will write an SQL command. So yeah, so let's try to do that. Create database, my project. Oops, let's actually delete. Let me delete. How to delete? Delete database. Yeah, I probably created it when I was like trying to come up with the tutorial. So now let's create again. Cool. After you like type in create database my project, it will show like create database. Then it means that your database is successfully created. And then after you create your database, you need to have like a user for you to interact with the database itself. So this user that you are creating here is kind of like the admin for the database. So yeah, now let's do that as well. And when you're trying to create a real world project, please use like an actual password instead of like the password. So yeah, but for now, for the demonstration purpose, I'll just use password. Okay. I guess let me just change the name. I'll call it my user. Cool. And then we will create the my user with password. Okay. Now we have created our first kind of like admin. And then we need to have some configuration set up. And this is pretty tricky. So I recommend it's essentially like saying that we need to have UTF-8 encoding. And this makes sure that we don't have like, this makes sure we can store any types of data into our database. Let's just copy and paste them. Cool. After you copy and paste it, you should probably see like, let's actually try to do this one by one. Enter my user. And outer row. And then we change the time zone to UTC. These are just some recommended configurations that you all can do. After you finish all the configuration, and then we need to grant all the privilege access to this user. Essentially, this way we can make the user a true admin. So let's do that. So grant. Let's just copy and paste it to my user. And after we grant all privileges to my user, you will see grant, and then we can access the PostgreSQL with this command. And now we have the PostgreSQL database configuration ready, and we can then try to connect Django with our PostgreSQL database that we have just created. You have probably noticed that we have done quite a lot of configuration, and this is pretty standard when you are just like getting started with like creating a database. This is something that we can not really escape. It's just something that we need to do for every database. So yeah. And now, if you haven't already, please install Django, and then we'll use the create Django app to create our project. now. Feel free to create a directory. I've already created here. And then after indexing to the directory, you run this. And then after a while, you should be able to see a manage.py file inside your root directory. And alongside manage.py file, there should be also a folder. And this folder is essentially the folders that contain all the Django stuff. So let's see. As you can see, it contains like setting, URLs. It's just pretty standard Django project. And this manage.py file, it's a very useful file when we are trying to connect a database with Postgresql. Connect a database with our Django project. And we'll see the use of this in a bit. So first of all, let's tell our Django backend to connect to the Postgresql database. So let's actually open up VS Code. And if you look at our settings, and if you search for instance, database, you can see that here. Database is actually its default to SQLite, because SQLite is like the easiest and most, not really the most common, but the easiest database that you can use. But right now we are actually using Postgres. So as a result, we also need to configure these settings as well. So this is what the database section looked like. And this is what we should be copy and pasting over. As you can see here, the engine is the engine that we are using, which we also install as well. When we are installing, as you can see, we have installed this package. This package is very useful for us to connect the Django app with the Postgresql database. It provides an interface for us to use so that like when we are changing, for instance, from Postgresql to another database, we don't really need to change the code. That's like the use of this package. And then the name will be the name of the of your database, which is my project. And the user here, we actually need to change it to my user, or at least I need to change it to my user because I have created a similar username before. The password would just be password. Host will just be localhost. Port, we can leave it empty. Let like database itself to find the port that they are using. So that's a little bit of configuration. And then we can, so after you have copy and paste the database configuration in, then we can start to use the manage.py file. So what does manage.py file do? It's essentially a very easy way for you to connect the database with the backend server. And also it's a very easy way for you to update the database model as well. So for instance, if you have created a user model, a model is kind of like how you would describe a database. For instance, this user model contains like name and age, and you want to add like a new field to the user model. So for instance, you want to add a description to the user model. And then, so after you add the description inside the model in the Python file, then you can also use the manage.py. You can run the same command again, basically manage.py migrate and then manage.py update, and then the database will be successfully updated. So manage.py is a very, very useful file. And now we are actually trying to create our user and do our first migration. So let's do that. So first of all, make sure you're inside the root directory of your project. Then run make migrations. No change detected because we are actually first just creating this database. And after you run migrate, you should be able to, so probably after migrate. So let's actually run this. We will just, password is the common. Yeah, let's create user anyway. What I've done is just I just call my password. So yeah. And so for super user, you are essentially like creating a user again, and then you can use all the default setting and then use the same password again. So that's for the username. And after you have set up your admin account, and then let's try to start up the Django development server. Let's try to change it to another port. Now let's check. Oh, I should probably use localhost instead of. Yeah. And it should be 8080 and cool. So essentially, remember to use localhost instead of like the 0.0000 they give us. Sometimes our computer will not interpret like 0000 as the localhost. So yeah. And after you have like run all of these commands, you should be able to see the Django installation successful like page up in the browser. Any questions so far? Also, if you go to admin, and if you log in with the super user password you have just created, and you should be able to see the admin page as well. So yeah, that's kind of like a further proof of the database successfully being set up. Any questions so far? Cool. Now let's move on to the more interesting stuff, where we will be doing all the cool operations with PostgreSql. So first of all, what's a curl operation? Call operations is just a way for you to like call all the operations that you can perform on a database. So C stands for create, R stands for retrieve, U stands for update, and D stands for delete. And these four operations kind of like dictates all the operations that you can do with database. I mean, there's like some other interesting operations, for instance, creating indices, but we will not really cover them since they're pretty advanced. And so yeah, and to actually demonstrate all the all the create, retrieve, update, and delete, we actually need to build something. So we decided to build a tutorial block with PostgreSql. And this way we can like retrieve block, we can update the block description, update the block title, delete some blocks, and also create some block. So yeah, and this is what we will doing for the next hour. And first of all, let's actually set up another app. And this app will be in parallel with the my project app. So run the following command, like the manage.py start app tutorials in the root folder of your project. And after you run this command, you should be able to see a tutorials folder inside besides the my project folder. And now let's go to tutorials. As you can see, you might notice that my project and tutorials, they have like pretty different starting files. This is due to that when we are creating my project, we actually use the different command. And usually we will just use this command, the start app, to like actually start an app within like an already built infrastructure. So my project is kind of like a way for us to connect to the actual database, and then the tutorials will be an app that uses this database to like build a backend server. So yeah, this is like the difference between tutorials and my project. And now let's go to tutorials app.py. You can see that we don't really have that much here. And this represents the Django app that we have just created. And so after we have created this app, as you can see in the apps.py, for us to connect this app with the database, we need to add this app into the installed apps array in settings.py. So let's do that. So first of all, go to my project, then go to settings.py, and then search for installed apps. And cool. And hit save. And this way, after we simply add this in, this app, the tutorials folder, will then be added into like an app inside the my project folder. And before we go into the actual like the interesting stuff, we also need to set up some configurations. First of all, we need to enable CORS, and this is essentially allow us to send requests within our own localhost server, and this is kind of like a allow us to bypass some safety issue. So yeah. So first of all, go ahead and install Django CORS headers. And cool. And after you install it, you install CORS. You include CORS inside the installed apps. So there it goes. We have CORS headers, and we also add the middleware class as well. These are some like one-time configurations that you only need to do once for each project. Oh, and here's a notice that cross middleware should be placed as high as possible. And so, which means that we should probably put it here. And especially before the common middleware. And this way we can ensure that we actually can receive all the requests before we go into the common middleware. And now let's see, do we have this? We don't have it. Now let's add a variable. There's some like extra configurations. Let's add it here. And CORS wireless, we actually, let's make it this and this way. So why do we include 8080 and 8081? Essentially, this way it allows, so without we installing the cross plugin, the cross app, we cannot really send a request from like say 88 then to 8081, which will be quite annoying when we are like trying to test our server in our local development. As a result, we include them in a whitelist, and this way we can make sure that we can receive all the requests. Cool. Up till this point, are there any questions for configurations? Cool. Okay, now let's move on to the actual interesting stuff, which is defining the model and also creating all the exciting routes. So first of all, let's think about if we are trying to create a blog, what do we want to include inside each blog post? This will kind of like this will determine what we need to put inside the Django model. So first of all, actually, what's a Django model? The Django model is what will determine how the database looks like. So for instance here, so for instance, in our blog post entry, we'll have a title, a description, and then a publish, whether it's published or not. And these three fields will be also, if we like define the model like this, these three fields will also be appear inside the Postgresql database. Now let's actually copy and paste it. And we need to place all the models here inside the models.py under tutorials folder. And let's look at, so first of all, we import models. This is just a way for us to interact with Django, with the Postgres model. And then let's look at each field. So first of all, the title. The title will be a field of character, which means that it will be a string. And it will have a max length of 70. And blank false means that it cannot be blank, which means that if the user tries to create a blog post with an empty title, the database will actually return an error. Notice that it's the database that will actually return error, not the backend server. As a result, the backend server also needs to address this problem. And the default will be like an empty string. And also the description here is also a string. However, the max length is a little bit longer. As you can see, it's 200 characters. And publish or not, this is a Boolean field. And the Boolean field will either be false or true. And if the user decides to publish it, they can update the publish field to true.
Oh, I have a question. If you can't leave a blank, why is the default necessary? Or yeah.
Yeah, I guess we can probably leave the default, but I'm not really sure whether the default is like a mandatory parameter or not. We can look it up real quick. Postgresql, Django. Looks like usually people either just do blank equal to true or just like default. Oh, let's see. I think maybe we can actually leave the default. We can actually leave the blank equals to false out if we are actually like using a blank default name. So yeah, this so for instance, so usually sorry, you're saying?
Oh no, I was just saying that makes sense.
Yeah. So usually what people will do is instead of like handling the error on the database side, we'll usually handle the error in the backend side. So I don't know why why I did this, but let's just stick with what I did. Yeah, we can try this out later. Like try deleting the blank equals false later. So yeah. And cool, so now we have 3 fields. And now let's try to update our database model. And this is where we will also use the manage.py. And how do we do the migrations? We can simply run this again. As you can see, after running migrations, what it will do is essentially migrate the model from here to the actual database. And as you can see, after you have run the migration, there will be a migrations folder here. And there will be like a 0001 initial.py. And this is where this is actually created by this manager.py file. Essentially, if you like have update something in the models and then you run migrations again, there will be another migrations like Python file created. And that migration Python file will kind of like depict what all the migrations have done. So for instance, if we look at the initial.py, includes like all the fields that we have created, and also an ID. ID is like an auto field that database added for for themselves. It's just unique identifier for each tutorial, so that we don't really need to worry about creating a UID for each tutorial. So yeah. And usually you won't really interact with the migrations folder that much. You will simply just use all the manage.py to handle all the migrations. So yeah. Cool. So after you run the migrations folder, then you will see this initial.py. This is the code generated by manage.py, just like I mentioned. Blah blah blah. And also, so essentially running make migrations tutorial will create the migrations. And to actually migrate, we also need to run Python manage.py migrate tutorials. So let's do that. Cool. And after you run this is what actually migrate the tutorials, migrate the migrations that we have made to the database. So yeah. Now we have our migrations in place. Do we have any questions till now? Cool. Now let's talk about the current operations. And so before we create our current operation, we actually need to create a serializer class. So what's a serializer class? It's a way for us to visualize all our data inside the database. So right now, all the objects that's stored in the Postgresql database is actually stored as an object. As a result, if we are trying to like print out all the results that we have received from the database, we'll just see like Python object. We'll not really see like the actual material inside each object. And to see it, we will need to manually like print them out, like object.id, object.title, which is pretty annoying. As a result, we will use something called serialization. Serialization is a method for us to serialize all the object, which means to instead of like, so we are calling print, instead of like the object being printed to the console, the actual content within an object will be printed to the console instead. So let's create a serializer. So let's do this. So let's create a new file called serializers.py, then copy and paste it. And REST framework, I believe this is something that's inherent in the inherent in the Django package. Though it's like showing the error, but I think this is included. So yeah. As you also as you can see in the tutorials serializer, we have a class meta, and this class meta we have a model called tutorial, and this model actually, sorry, as you can see here, this model is actually referring to the tutorial that we have created here, the tutorial class that we have created here. Essentially, what this serializer is doing is that it takes in a tutorial class, and then it looks at all the fields, and when it's being printed out, it will print out all the fields instead. So yeah. And after we create our serializer, we can now start to define routes and routing. So now let's start with like planning all our routes. So here are our plans. There will be like mainly 3 routes. The first route will be API/tutorials, and tutorials will have, this is like a way for us to interact with all the tutorials. There's a GET request. You can send a GET request, which is like retrieving all the tutorials. You can send a POST request, which is creating a new tutorial. You can also send a delete, which is like delete all the tutorials. There's also a separate route, which is under API tutorials/ID. This ID will be the ID for each blog post, and it will be get, put, and delete. This is all like operations on a single blog post. So yeah, and this is like, these are like operations on all the blog posts. We also have a URL called API/tutorial/publish. This is just a way for us to get all the published posts. So now with our routes like planning in place, let's actually write those down. So first of all, go ahead and create urls.py inside the tutorials app. So let's do that. URLs essentially this corresponds to all the URLs that Django app is using. Oops. And then you copy and paste these URL patterns into the urls.py. And what tutorials will do is that you will look at the urls.py file, and then you will match. This is just regex command. You'll match all the corresponding URL to all the URLs that we have right here. And also don't forget to include these URL patterns in the root URL configurations. So let's do that. So let's go to here. And this is saying that we probably need to import URL. Yeah, let's import URL as well. Cool. We also need include. Yeah, and this way, instead of like matching some random stuff, it will actually match everything inside the tutorials, the URLs page. And this way, when we are trying to, like, for instance, access the backend server, you will first go match all the URL, and then you will go to the tutorials, the URLs page, and then you will match like all the patterns here. So this is how we will structure our URL calls. And now let's write our API views. So first of all, let's actually so open views.py. Cool. Now our views.py's are all empty. Now let's write our following code here. Let's actually look at those line by line. So first of all, we import a bunch of stuff. And then we have these three API views in place. And these three API views correspond to the URL pattern we have just planned. If we look at here, we plan that when we are accessing API/tutorials, we have we can receive three HTML methods, which is get, post, and delete. So here in this tutorial, in this API view, we have the tutorial list, which means that this route will interact with a list of tutorial. And then, yeah, we haven't write out the actual content yet, but yeah, this is kind of like a skeleton code. And then similarly for the tutorial detail, this corresponds to the tutorial's ID. This allows us to interact with like one specific blog post. And the blog post will be like searched by the parameter copy k, which is just another ID, another form of ID. You can also like call the ID here, but yeah. We also have the get for the tutorial is published, and this corresponds to this particular URL here. So yeah. And now we have our skeleton code. Let's create our first route. So our first route will be a way for us to create a new object, which is like create a new post. So let's do this. As you can see, there's some. As you can see, we have used like elif here, and this is because we have implement the get. We usually put post like in a later position, but yeah. Now let's see. So if the request method is post, then we'll first parse the request first, and then we'll serialize all the data. And if the data is valid, then we return this response. And this is essentially like how we can this is how we can create and save a new tutorial. And now let's look at how we can retrieve a tutorial. Yeah, and this is how we will retrieve a tutorial. So essentially what we will do is, first of all, we call tutorials.objects.all, and .all will essentially fetch all the tutorials object from the tutorial database. And we will talk about how do we filter through each object later, but this is how we can get all the tutorials. So after we get all the tutorials, we can get all the title. And if the title is not known, which means that if we have at least like one tutorial, then we can if the tutorial is not known, then we filter out all the tutorials containing the title. I think this is just a way for us to ensure that if the database actually contains something that we don't want, for instance, if it contains some old data which doesn't have this format, we will not fetch those data. So after we fetch them, we will then serialize them, and then we return it as a JSON response to the front end. I probably forgot to mention. So when we are trying to create a new post, this line is what is actually doing all the heavy lifting. So first of all, we serialize all the data and make it so that the database can actually identify all the data. And then we see if the data is valid. If it's valid, then we call save. And after we call save, all the data will be saved inside a database. And this is how we will create a new post inside a Django database. And after we have like retrieve all the responses, we also return a JSON response containing like all the results from this tutorial serializer. As you can see here, the tutorial serializer, it contains all the data that's fetched from the tutorials. Here we pass tutorials inside tutorial serializer, and tutorial serializer will essentially make all the tutorials objects in a more human readable way. And this way, after we return it as a JSON response, it will be much easier for the front end to parse their data. So that's for retrieving all the objects. Now let's actually switch gear and run how do we retrieve a single object, since we have like get all the objects in place. So, and so if you remember, getting all the, interacting with all the tutorials, we do that in this view, and interacting with a single tutorial, we do that in this view. So let's do that. And cool. And so first of all, here, the skeleton code actually has already provided kind of like the how do we get the tutorials according to the ID that's being passed in. So essentially what this route is trying to do is that it will first taking a post ID, which is called a PK, and then we'll get this particular post according to the ID here. And after we get the post according to the ID, then we look at the method. And if the HTTP methods get, then we first of all serialize it and we simply return it, because it's simply like getting the object and which we have already done here. So yeah. Up till now, are there any questions before we move on to update and delete? Something I guess I should also mention is that when we are returning a JSON response, as you can see here, we are also returning the status. Yeah. So essentially, this should actually be here. Yeah. What essentially this does is that, for instance, if it's a post request, when we are trying to return the JSON response, we can also include as status code. We can also not include this as well. As you can see in the GET request, we don't really include this. But usually for a post request, we'll include a status code to simply say that, okay, we have successfully created your object in the database, and this is the status code. So yeah. Similarly, for the tutorial, if the user is trying to find a tutorial or a blog post that doesn't contain, that doesn't exist, we can simply return JSON response saying that this tutorial does not exist with a status code for not found. So yeah. And now let's move on to update and delete an object. So for update an object, we also do it inside the tutorial detail URL. Let's copy paste it here. And cool. As you can see here, when the message is put, which means that the user is trying to do an update, it will contain actually more data than a simple post ID, which means that we also need to parse the request. And that's why we also call the JSON parser, the parse request. This should be something that's pretty familiar. I believe Armaan has already covered it in the backend tutorial. So after we parse the data, and then we can serialize the data. Here we actually assume that the data is kind of like valid. I mean, we also check it here when we are checking like whether the tutorial serializer is valid. Oh yeah, this brings up a pretty good another point. So essentially what Serializer does is that, so besides making the objects prettier, it also we can also use it to check whether an object is valid or not. So for instance here, if the user passing an invalid object, after it passes through the tutorial serializer, for instance, it contains some invalid field, for instance, like age. Then if you run the if tutorial serializer is valid, it will actually return false. As a result, we will not save some invalid data to the database. So after we save it, we then simply respond it. Otherwise, we simply return a status code of 400 bad request, which means that their put request contains some invalid fields. As you can see here, the update method is actually very similar to the post method. This is because that we are simply like override the post when we are trying to update a post. So yeah.
Oh wait, yeah. So is the difference between put and post just that is post creating like a new tutorial and put is updating the tutorial that exists?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so there's like, so for instance, if we're trying to create a tutorial, we actually don't specify like the tutorial ID or any like tutorial related data. However, here, as you can see, the tutorial serializer takes in another parameter which is called tutorial. This is kind of like an already existing object. So if we passing an already existing object to it, this serializer will contains this information, so that when it hits save, it will actually override the tutorial itself, like creating a new one. So yeah, but the code looks really similar. So cool. So now let's talk about how do we delete a tutorial. This is fairly simple. So if the method is delete, we simply call delete. And this way, since we already have like find the object, then we simply call delete on it. And this way, we will delete the object. And then we can return a JSON response saying that the tutorial was deleted successfully. So this is how we write delete. And we also need to like delete all objects sometimes. So let's write that as well. And this is here. Inside interacting with all the objects. So if the request on message is delete, then we first of all, we find all the objects, and then we call delete method on all of them. And this way, this delete method will actually return the count, which is the number of tutorials that they have deleted, the database have deleted. As a result, we can also return this valuable information to the user. So as a result, we include it inside a JSON response message. As you can see, the count is actually an array. So yeah. the actual count, like the actual number, is located in the first entry. Cool. Yeah, that's it for the delete all objects. And now I think we only have like this published URL left. So let's work on this. So the difference between like a published tutorial and like getting all tutorials is that we actually need to do a filter. So this is like a good place for us to practice to see like how do we write a filtered database operations. So as you can see here, if we are fetching all the objects, we are calling tutorial.objects.all. However, if we're like filtering through some objects, we can call tutorials.objects.filter and then publish equals to true. And this way we can filter like the posts that only have the publish equals to true. After we get all the tutorials, then we look at the request methods, and then we serialize it, and then we return it as a JSON response. So that's how we like get a filtered search within a database. You can also use a filter search as a way to like get a single post as well. So for instance, you can also do this here. So tutorial.object.filter, ID equals PK. Or PK equals PK. That should be fine as well. And yeah. This is simply another way to do the filter. Or if you know the title of the post, for instance, if there are like two posts that you want to delete one with a duplicate title, you can also do this. Or like equals PK, or like whatever things that the user has passing. So yeah. Cool. And now let's start the Django project by running this. Let's see. We don't have anything at the root URL. So let's try tutorials. Yeah, as you can see here, if we simply run like tutorials, we get an empty bracket. Now let's actually open up Postman. Oops. I don't know whether Armaan has covered Postman or not, but Postman is essentially a tool for you to create requests to a backend server. And this way we can like test out some requests pretty easily. So let's create like Postgres. Oh, I think we already have some Postgres demo. Yeah, cool. So for instance, if we run like get API tutorials, yeah, as you can see here, we get an empty bracket, as we probably like imagined. Now let's actually try to create a new post. So here we are sending a post request to this URL. And inside the body, we have a title, a description. So yeah, let's try to hit send. As you can see. Cool. As you can see here, the body, like here's the body of the response. As you can see, we have the ID equals 1, and also publish default to false, and also the content that we have just created. Let's try to create another one. So part 1, nice database. Okay, we call it like, I don't know, orange juice. And let's actually try to make published equal to true. So let's save it, send. As you can see here, the ID increments 1 by itself. And this is like automatically handled by the database. As you can see here, the publish becomes true, description becomes orange juice. And now, oh yeah, now let's try to send a delete request. This is some logging. Let's create a new request. Delete a tutorial. So for instance, let's try to delete the first tutorial. Actually, before delete it, let's try to get all the tutorials again. So as you can see, if we run the get request on all tutorials, we have 2 tutorials right now. Now let's try to delete the first tutorial. If we hit send, as you can see, tutorials will delete successfully. And if we get again, as you can see, the first tutorial is deleted, and we only have the second tutorial. And let's try to create an update, create a pull request. So update tutorial, change it to put. And let's update the second one because this is the only one that we have. Oh, let me copy and paste the body, raw, JSON. Cool. And let's actually change it to like title. Let's make it updated. Update success. Content. Let's make it apple juice. And if we hit send, as you can see, it's updated successfully here. It returns the object after the updates. And if we get the object again, as you can see, it returns the updated object. So yeah, and that's it. So that's it for our tutorial on Postgres and Django current operations. Any questions?
If you reload your tab, will any changes be reflected?
Reload. Oh, do you mean reload here? Or you mean reload here?
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Yeah. So this is like, so if we just like visit the URL like in browser, it's like it's on default sending a GET request to the backend server. So we should get the same result from this GET request. So yeah. I'll actually stop sharing.